Hello, and welcome to this new webinar from the Geneva Center for Security Policy. My name is Jean-Marc Rickley. I'm head of Global Risk and Resilience at the GCSP. The GCSP is an international non-profit foundation physically based in Geneva, Switzerland, comprised of 53 states in the Foundation Council, of which all the permanent 5 member of the Security Council of the UN. The GCSP mission is to promote peace and international security, to prepare and transform individuals and organizations so they can create a safer world. We are impartial, independent, and inclusive. The center fulfills its mandate through different activities, through executive education, research, public discussion, as we do today, as well as an innovative innovation fellowship program. Our goal is to educate and help future leaders to be better at understanding international security and to nurture a global community of leaders who advance peace and security globally. Our community has grown substantially over the last 4 years. It reaches now more than 9,000 influential alumni around 165 nations. The GCSP celebrates this week its 25th anniversary. 25 years ago, when Switzerland joined NATO Partnership for Peace, the GCSP was created. And the GCSP invites you to think about the new normal. So over the last, these 3 days, started yesterday, we invite you to think about the new normal in different fields. The new normal has become a term that is very popular with the global pandemic and the need to readjust the way we live, we work, and we interact. The new normal also applies to geopolitics and warfare. Recent development in emerging technology have witnessed a tremendous prospect for military application. For instance, the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh demonstrating the key role played by drones that were both weaponized and not weaponized. Artificial intelligence also promises to speed up decision-making cycles in warfare and is already used with big data analysis. Development in synthetic biologies also offer some positive but also frightening prospect when it comes to the democratization of and the weaponization of this technology. In the field of geopolitics, a new normal is also emerging. In 2012, the Obama administration heralded its pivot to Asia strategy, which marks basically the recognition that Washington regarded East Asia as the center for the defense of its national interest. With the coming to power of Chairman Xi Jinping, China has adopted also an increasing affirmative policy in the region and beyond through the so-called, notably, Belt and Road Initiative since 2013. This year also showed a worsening of tension between China and the United States to the trade war that had been started 3 years ago between China and the United States. A war of words, of blame, has also taken part this year, especially when it comes to the way both countries handle the coronavirus crisis. According to SIPRI, in 2019, the United States had the largest defense expenditure with $732 billion, and China the second with $261 billion. We're ahead of India, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. What is more remarkable, though, is that 10 years ago, Chinese defense budget was only half of the current level. And in 2000, 20 years ago, it was 30 billion, so 9 times less. The Taiwan Strait this year has also witnessed a series of military exercises that led to a rise of tension. So to shed light about these two developments of emerging technology applied to the military, as well as the center of gravity of potential global confrontation in East Asia, we're very welcome today to we're happy to welcome Professor Michael Raska, who is assistant professor and coordinator of the Military Transformation Program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is the author of Military Innovation and Small States, Creating Reverse Asymmetry, and co-editor of Security Strategy and Military Change in the 21st Century, a cross-regional perspective, both published by Routledge. He is an expert on anything that deals with military matters in East Asia, and he holds a Ph.D. from the National University of Singapore, where he was a recipient of the President's Graduate Fellowship. Today, we also have with us my colleague, Francesca, who will help me at the end to moderate the question and answer. So we will start by the presentation of Professor Raska, and during the presentation, you can send us your question and answer in your question in the Q&A box. We will look at it, and in the end, I will ask Professor Raska the question you would like him to answer. So, without further ado, Michael, the screen is yours.
Thank you, John Mark. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone. I hope this finds you well and healthy in these very challenging times. It has been a very difficult and challenging year for everyone, but on the other hand, I think it brought the world a little bit together, through the online sharing, and we can learn as a community. And before I start, I also wanted to congratulate GCSP for the 25-year anniversary. The S. Rajaratnam School in Singapore has a very good relationship with Geneva Center for Security Policy, and I'm very honored and privileged, to share with you today some of my thoughts. Basically, today, my presentation will take about 45 minutes or so, plus minus, and I will be talking about defense innovation and future of conflicts in East Asia. And the way I'm going to structure it, basically, is into sort of four parts. Basically, I will start a little bit with the strategic context. Trying to explain, trying to give you a framework, or how should we think about East Asian security in the sort of first half of the 21st century. So the strategic context is very, very important to understand anything related to defense and military matters in the region. Then I will give you sort of the technological concept, the technological frame, and where I will introduce what I call the AI RMA Wave. It's a concept that I have just published in the Journal of Strategic Studies, and basically where I try to position the AI and emerging technology wave in relation to the previous RMA waves as a revolution in military affairs, and try to explain what is different. And then I will focus a little bit on China. I think everyone is interested what China does and what the Chinese trajectories are. So I will explain a little bit sort of my framework on how can we conceptualize Chinese progress and Chinese trajectory in terms of defense innovation and what the Chinese thinking is. And then, try to bring it back home, what are the strategic implications of all that. So there's a lot to cover, and I will try to, keep it as broad as possible, really, so to accommodate all this amazing wide audience. And more importantly, I look forward to your questions. So let us start. Basically, my main argument. What is the main argument that I'm trying to do in today's presentation? Well, basically, I argue that East Asia is a culmination. What's going on is the culmination of diverse security challenges, security threats, and the diffusion of new technologies brings about sort of a new wave of defense transformations in the region. And the new wave of defense transformation is going to be the center point. The East Asia is going to be center point of the new wave of defense transformation. So basically, if you think about East Asia, it's what my mentor, Professor Chang-Min Lee, would say is a supermarket of security threats. So you have nonlinear threats, human security, environmental security issues, pandemics. You have asymmetrical threats in the region, WMD proliferation, nuclear weapons. You have low-intensity conflicts and terrorism in terms of extremist ideologies and whatnot. And at the same time, you have basically strategic competition, high intensity threats, and conventional conflicts, the possibility of that. And these are basically culminating and creating a new complex security environment. And at the same time, you have the diffusion of these emerging technologies in the region, and that creates, that expands the battle space, creates, different forms of conflicts, changing the character of conflicts, and creates sort of a new, as I said, a new wave of revolution of military affairs. So in today's talk, basically, three things that I want to start with: the questions, what has changed? What is new? What is not changed? What I think will remain stable or same? And for policy-oriented perspective, what should change? So I will try to answer these three simple questions throughout, and try to come up, with the final conclusion. So let's start, more on the strategic context. I already mentioned Professor Changmin Lee has been my mentor for almost 2 decades, and he is the author of this very, very excellent book called The Fault Lines in East Asia, where he's looking at all the diversity of security challenges and security threats of the region. And basically the argument there is that the region is, as I mentioned, is a supermarket of security threats, but at the same time, it is embedded in economic interdependencies. It is embedded in multilateral institutions. It is embedded in a lot of cooperative frameworks. So you have the region which is very diverse, and that is entangled in both strategic competition as well as cooperation. So on one hand, you have the interdependencies, the good positive side of Asian economic rise, and at the same time, you have new emerging strategic challenges. And these new challenges have been accelerating over the past decade or so, and even more so during the pandemic, where a lot of these issues have come up. So, of course, number one issue is how do you accommodate and balance China's rise, Chinese sharp power? You have a lot of these regional security flashpoints and challenges that I will talk about just a little bit. You have socioeconomic challenges and internal domestic issues that challenge the governance. You have political transitions, and also very, very importantly, unresolved historical legacies. So when you think about East Asia, it's a complex web of security challenges, both old and new and emerging, and where the past, present, and future are intertwined. But what is different, what is changed, what is changed is, if you look at the traditional sort of flashpoints, the hotspots in the region, Korean Peninsula, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, the Mekong River Delta, and beyond to the Indian Ocean, these flashpoints have existed for decades. But what is new right now is that these flashpoints are increasingly intertwined. And they're increasingly intertwined because of the strategic competition between great powers, China and the United States. So each regional flashpoint can actually entangle superpowers together, and the possibilities or risk of conflict spillovers from one flashpoint to another is basically increasing. But nevertheless, if you think about, for example, the South China Sea 10, 15 years ago, it was a sort of a regional issue where the ASEAN or the Southeast Asian countries were dealing with China sort of quietly. Now South China Sea is also part of geopolitical contest of the future of supremacy between China and the United States. So each conflict really is increasingly intertwined, and each conflict has potential ramifications in terms of potential escalation. So there is that strategic uncertainty in the security complexity, if you will. And what is also where I mentioned, or what many commentators or what commentaries should be noticed really is the historical element, the unresolved historical legacy of each flashpoint, whether it is the Korean Peninsula, whether it is the Taiwan Strait, whether it's the South China Sea or the Mekong River Delta. The history, the present, and the future are increasingly intertwined. But as I mentioned, one more important fact is to note is in each flashpoint that you see, there is an increasing Chinese footprint. And as China has been rising over the past 3 decades or so, its strategic reach and interest have been penetrating into each flashpoint, and each flashpoint basically reflects increasing Chinese footprint. And you can make a presentation on each of the flashpoints separately, and this could be a great conference for another day. So in all the security strategic complexity, basically you have what's going on is this contest for future supremacy in the region. So we hear the word strategic competition, but strategic competition is, it means a lot more other sort of competitions. You have a military technological competition, economic competition, industrial competition, geopolitical competition, cultural competition. So strategic competition is between great powers is a much more comprehensive, multidimensional, and includes a variety of dimensions. But the competition is reflected precisely in these flashpoints, in great power rivalries, in increasing nationalism, in weakening regional diplomatic networks, in shifting political alignments, in gray zone conflicts, territorial disputes, you name it. But basically what's going on right now, when you think about strategic competition, it is the contest of the future supremacy, who is going to control the political and economic security grids that have been created in the post-World War II in the region. So the stakes are very, very high. And in that context of competition and cooperation, technology and innovation plays a very, very important role. So innovation, in a sense, is the source of national security. At the same time, it is the source of international power. The technologies, the emerging technologies that are coming online, they're all promising to be revolutionary. Innovation is becoming central element to international influence. It's basically source of an international power, as I mentioned, and great powers as well as small states and middle powers see the opportunity to shape their political trajectories through technological innovation. So competition over the technological leadership that is inherently part of the strategic competition is the central for generating economic competitiveness, for political legitimacy, military power, and in case of China, also social stability. So a country that can innovate and produce advanced technologies will give you more economic power, economic strength, military power, and also intangible benefit of perceived leadership. And what is very interesting part of that competition for these emerging technologies is just like you have a convergence of security challenges, you have a convergence of emerging technologies. So that includes, these 4 baskets that you see here. It's about perception, processing, cognition, technologies that include AI, cloud computing, big data analytics. You have new materials coming online, biomaterials, composites, a lot of, innovation going on in communication, navigation, targeting, manufacturing, logistic, and supply chains. So the convergence of these technologies and the contest of these technologies inherently part of that strategic competition that is going on. And what is different also is that these emerging technologies are, being sourced from the commercial sector rather than the military. So the ability to exploit these technologies in the military is becoming, central challenge for military organizations in the region. And that leaves us, to the sort of the next phase of my presentation. Really, what is it leading to? And it is leading to sort of the new AI RMA wave that I introduced, that I mentioned in the introduction. The idea is that over the last 4 decades, we have seen 5 revolutions in military affairs. They started with the Russians' conceptions of military technical revolution during the 1980s. Then the Americans have adopted 3 or 4 phases of the RMA in their military modernization. But the conventional sort of revolution RMA narrative was about integrating digital technologies into existing weapon systems, into existing conventional weapon systems. However, with the militarization of AI and with these emerging technologies, the new AI RMA wave, and this is what I argue in my new article in Journal of Strategic Studies, is different. It differs because of 3 simple factors. One is the US is no longer, does not have the monopoly of the RMA. So you have multiple RMAs emerging simultaneously. The US RMA, AI RMA, the Chinese AI RMA, a little bit of the Russians, and of course, small states and middle powers who have the opportunity for the first time to shape their force modernization or sort of military innovation through these emerging technologies. And it's also different because of the dual nature of these new emerging technologies that is being sourced in the commercial arena. So basically, we are moving, into a completely new phase of the character of warfare. And the militarization of AI is basically, AI system is basically at the core of that defense transformation. So to give you, again, this is what I just talked about, it's about AI systems integrating into sensors and shooters. And really, as I mentioned, the AI RMA wave, how it differs from the previous IT RMA waves over the past 4 decades. But what is really also interesting, and I argue that the previous IT RMA waves, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, right, they have generated this huge promise of military effectiveness coming up from new technologies. None of the 5 waves initially have been really successful. They have been only partially, implemented. So the Russians were first to conceptualize, but they were absolutely, far away to implement it. The American military has implemented, or have to some level, select elements of these ideas, for example, related to network-centric warfare, but none of the 5 waves have really lived up to its promise, at least the way they were conceptualized, right? So the question is really whether the AI RMA wave, whether it will be able to be implemented, and I argue yes, but because it's so different from the others. So in any case, we are moving into a next phase of defense transformation, and that defense transformation, the center point, the center of gravity will happen in East Asia. So for those of you who have a little background on AI systems, basically we are talking about automated systems that can learn directly from data and to do tasks that are complicated. So for any AI systems to function, you have to have different data points, data types that are being processed by algorithms in different areas, and they can have a potential military use. So, for example, you can use data from your maintenance, to give you optimization for your maintenance and logistics, for your deployment, for your for the use for your weapons. You can use AI systems to detect cyber attacks, and basically the applications are endless. But of course, data, algorithms, hardware, and software all combined. Now let's move to the next phase. Okay, we have this competition, right? And how do we conceptualize, or where everybody is asking me, well, how is China doing this vis-a-vis the US? how do we conceptualize that, arms competition? It's not an arms race, it's that competition dynamic. And in my book, I have, and in my article recently in the journal called Prism, I basically introduced this this framework that has evolved over the past few years. So for any sort of military innovation to be implemented, you need technology. So you have the technological patterns, and every military speculates about new technology, then it experiments, that it implements. That's sort of a Thomas Mankin framework, right? Then you have the conceptual path of innovation. So you emulate concepts, then you adapt them, and then you try and come up with your innovative concepts. And if concepts and technological patterns, sort of innovation patterns combine, then you might have also organizational change. And then that happens in stages where you can explore, the change. Then you can modernize, you have a modernization phase. And at the highest level in theory, you will have a transformation. So the story here is that China has basically accelerated its shift from being, copier and adapter of copier and, of technologies into more adapter of technologies, is adapting, experimenting with emerging technologies, perhaps even more than the US in certain areas, right? But the story is really that China has been accelerating its capabilities, its capacity to innovate. And it has, over the last, and I will, show a few slides on it, it has basically tried to, find the strategy that would close its technological gaps with the great powers, and at the same time, leapfrog as fast as possible to develop internal capacity to innovate. So a lot of the discussion on Chinese model and how China innovates, you will hear the word civil-military innovation, or military-civil fusion, I'm sorry. And this concept, military-civil fusion or civil-military fusion, is nothing new. It has evolved over the past 4 decades. And it's the idea is, as the concept has also evolved in Chinese strategic thinking, and you can see nicely here where the concept of, locating military potential in civilian technologies started, in the, early 1980s, where both the defense industry and and Chinese state companies, they had to work together to share resources. There were very limited resources. In the 90s, defense innovation was completely non-existent. Chinese defense technology in the 90s was obsolete. They came up with, modernizing systems and technologies from the, from the 50s and 60s, and they reached a point where they could not do that anymore. So they started to combine civil and military industrial base. And over the last sort of decade under Xi Jinping, you see a lot of emphasis on indigenous innovation. Again, it's a, taking that concept of civil-military fusion further, where you can do technology transfer from advanced nations and, again, accelerate that innovation drive. And now we are moving, again, even more toward what we call independent innovation, where China wants to be the world powerhouse in scientific and technological research. Now, to give you, this is very abstract, so to give you some specific example how that worked in practice. So case point, DF-21D, the so-called carrier killer, missile that you often read in the newspapers and the news. That missile has been evolving, for the last 40 years, from the conceptions of, early conception of sea-launched ballistic missiles, the JL-1. And through the process, what Tai Min-chung would call architectural innovation, where you have sort of gradual modernization or gradual improvement, upgrade of these system, of these technologies, that leads to, to gradual sort of phased improvement in capability. So over the last 4 decades, that missile and the technologies have gradually evolved through the concept of architectural innovation. So that means you leave, you change the components which are linked together while leaving the core design concepts intact. And that was basically tied to that, second phase of, open innovation, human localization of military capacity within the civilian sphere and whatnot. Now, over the past decade or so, there has been a lot of talk on indigenous innovation. I already mentioned that China does not copy anymore as it used to, in the 90s, where they, for example, reverse engineered, the Su-27 and whatnot. Now, it looks like they take, the main concept, main basic frame of a technology, but internally, it's a completely indigenous product. So the indigenous innovation idea is to basically, it's what they call the IDAR, where you identify, digest, absorb, and reinvent foreign technologies. And the idea is not simply just to copy these technologies, but understand the process management, understand the science behind these technologies. And so it's a hybrid approach to technological development based on foreign models and homegrown initiatives. Again, Tai Min Chung has done fantastic research on this. There's a lot of publications on that. So this has been sort of, for example, you can see here J-31 looks very much like a US F-35, in terms of design, right? But internally, it has a lot of, indigenous components. But now what I argue, with emerging technologies, China is moving again to the next phase, of its innovation trajectory, what we can also call independent innovation. And the idea is to reduce dependency on foreign technologies, to craft and leverage synergies between defense commercial developments and supply chains, and basically, long story short, integrate emerging technologies into the military. And case point, you can see, so for example, last year there was a big military parade, and we see a lot of experimental prototypes or models, showcasing in that parade. And one of them that caught my attention was the WZ-8. Basically, it's a high-speed altitude reconnaissance drone, and that can fly up to Mach 7, between Mach 6 to 8, and it can provide basically surveillance, reconnaissance over area of geographic area. So it reduces the dependency on Chinese satellites, and if Chinese satellites are basically taken out or disrupted, this provides a very important redundancy to targeting and situational awareness. But it's what I understand is this is a very unique drone, and it's not the only one, but it's a sort of example where architectural innovation, indigenous innovation, now the independent innovation, are accelerating or they are leaving their mark. So to operationalize this, how the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, how they're thinking about these new technologies. There's a lot of work done by Elsa Kania. I'm looking up to her a lot on her work, and many others. But basically, you see that Chinese writings, are arguing that the form or the character of future war is changing precisely because of emerging technologies. And also the perceived threats to China's national interests are changing because of the geopolitical competition that I mentioned and the convergence of security challenges that I mentioned. So we see a lot of, a shift, in Chinese strategic thought and writing, toward what we call intelligentized warfare. And intelligentized warfare is this holistic concept that is focusing on integrating AI and emerging technologies into the 21st century PLA type of force. And it includes, again, organizational changes, conceptual changes, as well as technological changes. But nevertheless, the Chinese believe that we are in a new era or a new revolution in military affairs where they see a strategic opportunity to leverage or exploit these technologies that will provide them with the military advantage in the future conflict. And a lot of that is focusing on what they call domains of new military rivalry. And it is the combination of these asymmetric domains: space, near space, cyberspace, underwater. So basically, in space, you focus on developing your space-based capabilities, satellites, launching capabilities, strategic missile force. Near space, those are hypersonic missiles, the ability to dominate that domain. You have cyberspace capabilities, tremendous cyber investments, as well as underwater domain. That means submarines, unmanned underwater vehicles, and a lot of the technologies there. And what is different, I think, compared to the U.S. or Western thinking, is really the Chinese holistic combination of all this of these domains that can force multiply, or where each domain can provide support the other. So there has been a lot of modernization going on of the PLA. Always long story short is China is prioritizing basically everything in all this military innovation trajectory, because they simply throw resources and on everything they can. But generally speaking, you see a sort of a dual track military modernization trajectory. On one hand, they are upgrading the conventional legacy system, the third and fourth generation of weapons. So think about conventional tanks, ships, the submarines, aircrafts, and at the same time, however, they are investing significant resources in these new emerging technology domains, and where you see a lot of prototyping and a lot of experimentation. And the experimentation and prototyping is happening in these four domains: space, near space, cyberspace, and underwater. So a lot of the PLA writing, if you think about, how they want to progress, is they move for what they call mechanization, which is, again, the idea is you mechanize the force, think about sort of the conventional reconnaissance strike complexes of the 80s, 90s, to informatization, which is sort of the Chinese concept of network-centric warfare. And then, at the end, and next phase is that what a lot of people would call intelligentization. And the idea, again, is leveraging emerging technologies in the PLA. And with the technological capacity of the PLA improving, so does its operational reach, and so does its strategic direction, so does it change its strategic direction. So for right now, you see the core missions of the PLA focusing on Taiwan and territorial defense, but now also increasingly on East and South China Sea contingencies, sort of the first island chain. But long term, 10, 15 years from now, they will have, or maybe even sooner, they will have the ability to extend their power projection and presence to the Indian Ocean. So that's why the Indo-Pacific or Indo-Indian Ocean becomes strategically important. And by 2049, China envisions its military to become a global military power. So you see, they have a very clear, sort of step-by-step phase approach to the modernization, and they have a strategy and resources to pursue that. So what does that all mean? It means that U.S. and its allies in the region have, growing strategic challenges. So on one hand, China is deploying these asymmetric high-tech systems designed to threaten U.S. Methods of power projection. Means freedom of action and forward deployed basing. And that entails growing operational risk for the US and its allies in the region. So that also comes up with increasing risk of deterrence failure, increasing cost of long-term competition, rising potential cost of intervention, and all the range of all the other complex operational risk. So where that imposes costs on the US. So the key question basically is this: at what point will the US military assets be nullified by the growing PLA assets, or at the very least weakened significantly? That question is generating lots of debate, on different spectrums of policy and expert community. There's arguments that basically say that China will never catch up to the US. It doesn't, that doesn't have, its innovation model is basically detrimental to the US innovation culture and other factors. So on the other hand, you have analysis that argues that China in many respects has already overtaking the US in certain areas such as ballistic missile development or AI. Nevertheless, this question generates lots of debate in the policy community and basically keeps our jobs. So my answer to this question, if I go back to my book on military innovation in small states, I basically look at institutional agility. So the idea is really how, in order to integrate emerging technologies and turn it into military advantage, you need, strategic and operational adaptability. That means you have to come up with the concepts that would provide the thinking behind the use of new technologies. Then you have to integrate these new technologies into your defense management capacity. That means defense planning and management. That means you have to allocate sustained amount of resources and significant resources to build that capacity and plan for the long run. And at the same time, you have to have organizational culture that is capable to embrace change. Because these new technologies by themselves, will not be absorbed immediately. You will have, military organizations are very, very conservative and resistant to change. So which military culture will be more conducive to change, will be able to absorb new technologies faster. So when you combine that, these elements, then you will have some level of institutional agility, and those organizations or military organizations with higher levels of institutional agility will be able to absorb, exploit, and leverage these technologies better and faster. So again, you need to have concepts, you need to have processes, and you need to turn them into advantage, both in the short term and long term. Of course, this is a very academic model. In a reality, it's a lot more complex than this. But generally speaking, technology, the bottom line is technology in itself doesn't turn into a strategic advantage by default, right? So the US military, of course, doesn't sleep. It is focusing a lot of attention on, emerging technologies. And the third offset strategy that was there a few years back, even though nobody the term has been stopped being used, a lot of the programs and priorities from the third offset is being developed in the US. So what I'm trying to say, innovation is always relative. So as China is trying to accelerate its innovation path, it always has to be measured relative to the US, the US side. So in the US, you see a lot of emphasis on emerging technologies, particularly on human-machine teaming. You will have a lot of conceptual and technological experimentation with unmanned drones and unmanned vehicles in different domains. And really, again, it's going back to that institutional agility. The problem is not about developing these technologies, but more importantly, to integrate them into the force structures, into the concepts, into the defense managing processes, into resource allocation and others. So I would argue that both in US as well as China, really the institutional agility, the idea of the challenge of integrating these technologies and creating the military potential is the greatest challenge for them. So to sum it up, in a sense, where does it all headed to? So I think the future conflicts in East Asia will be very hybrid. This is a very fashionable word, but in the end, it will be very mixed. On one hand, you will have high-end capabilities in the region. So what I mentioned, all these emerging technologies, the big gun stuff, the sophisticated conventional warfare type of arsenals they are being designed to generate deterrence. I would argue that neither China or US are interested to fight each other directly. So you will have the cost-imposing strategies being implemented on one another to develop these type of technologies in terms that arms competition dynamic that I mentioned, and that in order to raise the cost and risk for intervention, and that sort of create, increase the forms of deterrence. But at the same time, you will see a lot of the gray zone conflict areas in these flashpoints. So where ambiguity, deception, and a sort of limited, low intensity type of engagements under the threshold of war will be increasingly prevalent. That is already going on right now, for example, in South China Sea. So you will have Coast Guard ships facing each other. You will have fishing fleets facing each other. You will have all these gray zone type of engagements that will define the particular flashpoints. But in the absence of, military cooperation or defense diplomacy, if you will, or confidence building measures, it will be increasingly risky to diffuse the tensions if something flares up. So if you have an incident in South China Sea or East China Sea, the potential for escalation is significantly high in the absence of defense diplomacy and confidence building measures. So final slides. What possible takeaways when you go home today and think about my talk? What has changed? What has changed is the complexity of security environment. So military operations are spread across the spectrum of conflict. The flashpoints are converging, and at the same time, you have new emerging technologies that are accelerating military change. What has not changed, and this is very important, is the importance of human domain of warfare. The idea that technology doesn't drive warfare; it's the human domain. It's also the Clausewitzian elements of warfare, the fog and friction, the idea that everything in battle it becomes complex and frictious, and that human will can overcome. There is a contest of human will, if you will. The need for sustained regional expertise. You need that has not changed. You need to have sufficient or necessary basically focus on the regional expertise. You need to have experts focusing on the region. And what has not changed is also interoperability with other services and entities. So each military organization in the region, interoperability with other services, for example, US allies in Korea or Japan, or Australia, that has not changed. That factor of interoperability will become even more important. And what should change really, for militaries, really, if you want to get the military advantage, you have to think about, emerging technologies in new ways. How do you educate your officer corps, senior leaders? What are your strategic expectations on these technologies? And of course, novel tactics, techniques, and procedures. So those are more on the technical and operational level if you are in a military in the region. So that basically covers it all. I think I was spot on 45 minutes mark, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, fantastic, Michael. Thank you very much for this really great overview of both the strategic situation in Asia and the way it triggers down to more military and defense concept. We have a series, a few questions that popped up, but before we go through that, I would like to ask you one or two questions. The first one relates to the concept, the operation concept that China is developing. You showed that they are covering an entire spectrum of potential threat, but are there any specific operation concept to the Chinese PLA?
Well, of course, you have that military strategic guidelines, winning a war under informatized conditions that have basically guided the PLA for the last decade or so. But really, the idea is that the form of warfare, the shift toward intelligentized warfare, is basically shaping the conceptual trajectory or conceptual development trajectory right now in the PLA. So I would argue that with the new revolution of military affairs, right now the PLA is on the process of development these new operational concepts. So for example, again, how do you integrate AI with the drones, with with your command and control systems, with your communication, and basically all the other aspects. So the strategic community in China, in the National Defense University, they have, there's a lot of, emphasis on the conceptual development, right? But the operationalization of these concepts is still far, across the PLA is still far away. So you see a lot of experimentation and adaptation, but the actual implementation across the PLA is very sporadic, and it will take a long time.
I see. Well, in a way, it mirrors also recent development in the U.S., where the U.S. is investing heavily for the JAG, for instance, in AI. And so in this framework, basically what you showed is that 2049 is the year where China would like to become the next hegemonic power. That means it has to compete with the United States. And what the United States have in terms of competitive advantage, maybe still its power that is the ability to reach globally and to have allies globally, but also to have a global defense market. To what extent is China now investing in both, in more soft power as well as defense, providing defense equipment worldwide, and how is this evolving?
Well, that's also very interesting sort of development because China has over the last 15 years or so shifted from being a large net arms importer, so being dependent on foreign technologies, arms technologies primarily from Russia, to become a third largest arms exporter. So as Chinese military technologies are maturing, sort of the third and fourth generation, the Chinese have increasing confidence to offer these technologies on new markets. Most, across, Africa, Latin America, and parts of Central Asia, where they can, indirectly compete with the Russian arms sector, but at the same time, carve their position along the geopolitical lines of influence. But, of course, no one is lining up to buy Chinese fighter jets. No one is buying, this, if you will, no one is standing in line for these technologies. What China has been, doing is they've been being able to compete on price, right? So a lot of these technologies are, subsidized or being offered on, very good loan terms, right, to developing countries, which have really, which is a, they don't really have a choice to buy very expensive sort of Western type of armaments. And at the same time, even though China has just recently come up with sort of arms export guidelines, China has not been really tied to arms export sort of limitations, if you will, right? So the combination of, cost and price, and, potential. So for example, if you buy 2 submarines, in case of Thailand, they'll give you 1 for free. It creates incentive for developing countries, to buy the Chinese arms exports. But again, it's the question of reliability and performance, because besides drones, none of the other major weapons platforms, such as tanks or fighter jets, have been used in combat. I think the big story, the shining story here, are the drones, the Chinese drones exports. And yeah, again, they are way cheaper than the American counterparts, but also they are also increasingly unreliable for that price. So if you buy 3, maybe you have a chance that one of them, gets through. But nevertheless, the Chinese arms exports industry really has been very successful in terms of exporting drones. I think Serbia has gotten a few high-level drones recently. They have been using combat in Nigeria. Of course, a few of them have crashed. Iraq has bought them. So there are a number of countries in the world that are, increasingly adopting Chinese drones.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we can also see this development in the Gulf, where Saudi Arabia and the UAE are also relying strongly on this drone. This is a kind of frightening prospect, what you just said, that they are not so much reliable, and the fact that the tanks, for instance, they had not been used in battle. So for China to actually be credible, they would need to test, to go for the test of battle. Hopefully, this will not happen. Now, I will shift to Francesca for she had time to read all the questions that the audience is asking, and we will alternate, Francesca and I, to ask you. We picked up a few questions. Francesca, you want to kick off with the first question, please?
Yes, of course. So one question in regards with the competition between China and the US. A person comments, the competitions are very important and different in this rivalry. Geopolitics, geoeconomics, military. But what are the negative impacts of these different competitions on the other countries?
Can you repeat that again? What is the negative impact?
What are the negative impacts of the different type of competitions between China and the US on other countries in the world?
I see, on other countries. Okay, of course, there's a lot of debate on the potential implications. One example that I can think of in the debate is the idea of innovation winter. So if you have, two different, the decoupling, if you will, between technological systems, from the Western and the Chinese, you will have, also decoupling from talent, ideas, and innovation. So the whole globalized type of model of innovation where, people could move freely, and share ideas, and that would accelerate the innovation, that model is changing. So with increasing decoupling, one argument is that the innovation will slow down. People will not be able to travel and change companies. The technologies will be confined. There will be increasing barriers to technologies, and that will inherently be detrimental for innovation. At the same time, however, there are a lot of opportunities. So if you're a country like South Korea, where I used to live for 5 years, and you are entangled in that competition, of course, you have a lot of strategic dilemmas, right? Because under increasing pressure from both countries, great superpowers, US and China, but at the same time, you have technological powerhouse, that will enable you to compete with others. So providing a viable alternative, to the varying models. So inherently, there are a lot of enablers and constraints for different geographical areas, and I think it is, I'll go back to that innovation winter idea. Is really that innovation will actually slow down, and you will see a lot of bifurcation of technological systems. So case point, when you travel before, you would change a SIM card, in a different country, right? So now next 10 years or so, maybe even sooner, when you travel, you will shift into a different information zone, or different internets. You will have different technologies. So there will be a lot of barriers, if you will, and right now, and the question is really which system will be able to achieve its dominance or future supremacy in the world. So it's inherently a contest on the future of technological supremacy in the world. And countries, of course, have to make choices. So they will be increasingly under pressure from both superpowers, also from both great powers, and that will increasingly constrain the options and provide new dilemmas.
Yeah, I concur with what you just said, with the caveat that in terms of innovation winter, maybe what we might say, because of the democratization of emerging technology, we will maybe see some breakthrough, not among traditional militaries, but it could be non-state actors or even individuals. And that kind of possibility is quite frightening, because we will possibly not be able to control the consequences.
And there's also a counter argument to that. You can say, well, with increasing strategic competition, you will have a greater acceleration of innovation, because that will force you, it will provide a strategic necessity to be better, right? So on one hand, you have the innovation winter argument, innovation will slow down, but the other camp would argue, no, innovation will actually accelerate because of the necessity to compete, a necessity to dominate, and that will force each system to accelerate the innovation.
Yeah, similar to what we witnessed in the end of the 50s and 60s, and race to space. There was a question on how do you assess the recent Chinese-Russian cooperation in AI and new technology for warfare, and perspective for these two countries?
It's an excellent question. It's an area where I'm looking at right now on this subject. I think that we can make that argument that the traditional model of Sino-Russian military technical cooperation has been shifting. So over the last 2 decades or so, as China was dependent on Russian technologies, it has consistently decreased importing sort of finished weapon systems and relied increasingly on subsystems and components, right? And that model has been sort of characterized in sort of one-off military technical cooperation. And the question is really right now is whether they can synergize their long-term strategic planning developments of emerging technologies, synergize their resources and efforts to work together on and complement each other. Again, there's a lot of debate on that. One argument is, at the bottom level, there's a strong distrust between these countries. There's a lot of resistance on the, at the operational side, to share information, to share resources, and to work together. However, on the top-down side, you have a lot of political convergence at the strategic level, because you share the common strategic objective to, counter U.S. influence and preponderance of power in different geographical areas. So, and that basically forces them to work together. Now, there's a lot of funding, a lot of joint funding, a lot of, in Russia, you have all the different science parks, joint ventures that are being spun out and trying to be developed. I think, again, on one hand, I think the Sino-Russian relationship has never been better. And there's a lot of efforts to develop these technologies. The question is whether there will be joint development, such as, in the high strategic areas, such as what President Putin announced, that Russia will work with China on early warning missile defense systems. To what degree that will be operationalized is very hard to ascertain from open sources. But I would argue that, again, you can, you have to look at it comprehensively at the relationship, the political, economic, and other factors that define that relationship, and the opportunities and interests of each country to work together. So in some certain areas, of course, there will be joint experimentation, perhaps, even further toward, some sort of a planning and joint planning. To what degree they will be actually synergized it's early to tell, right? And because of different factors, again, culture, history, distrust, and other factors. So there's, you can wake up one morning and you see, oh wow, this is going to actually make a difference, and next morning you wake up and say, no, these guys will not work together.
Yeah, for sure. And they also have different stages of development in terms of AI. I mean, the Russian really involved in robotization, a bit less now on AI. But yeah, it's also a matter to have similar convergence and state of technological development. Francesca?
Yes, we have another question. Do you believe that the gray zone mentioned earlier will never escalate to the point of a possible annexation of Taiwan by China?
Oh wow, that's a very good question. I think really Taiwan will become, one of the certain of all the flashpoints that I mentioned. Taiwan will become increasingly, important for all these different flashpoints. I think the options for the China to take Taiwan are increasing gradually. The cost of taking, it's not. The military options are increasing. So, for example, you don't have to, invade Taiwan. You can create, naval blockade. You can create, create all the different sort of, like you mentioned, the gray zone type of contestation of the different domains over Taiwan. That's already happening. If, again, some of the incidents could escalate, yes, they could spill over, and then the question is really where are the confidence building mechanisms or the crisis management mechanisms, to manage the mitigation of that conflict. So it is possible. Simply, you will see a lot of forces operating side by side. There will be a lot of contestation, a lot of encroachment of the Chinese forces into the Taiwanese space, and so does the U.S. will probably also try to counter that through the political signaling and messaging that the U.S. will support Taiwan in types of contingency where if PLA will take the gamble and try to do something serious such as this. But really, you will see is happening already right now. I think the gray zone is reflected in the political warfare that is happening, the political, legal, informational, other aspects of Chinese Communist Party trying to impose control over Taiwan and restrict others from cooperating with Taiwan. So that is part of the gray zone, and of course, the U.S. trying to counter that. So the political warfare element is part of the gray zone conflict and includes information, cyber, legal, media warfare, and other aspects that are already happening. To what degree they can escalate into the conventional arena, it is if the tensions get very high, the possibility of some sort of a military engagement also increases. But China has signaled that it will focus on retaking Taiwan, quote unquote, within the next decade or so, and everything the PLA does for the most part is really focusing on that goal.
Yeah, I mean, we as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, we've seen that already this summer with the rising tensions in the Straits. We have a series of questions that deals with military innovation and diffusion. So basically, how will this innovation trickle down and in the region, and are there still rooms for smaller countries like Singapore to jump in and see an opportunity to actually leverage the position?
Yeah, of course. That's the exciting part of emerging technologies, that it's not only the domain of great powers. So the idea is that small states and middle powers such as Singapore, Korea, can exploit the innovation trajectories, can exploit these emerging technologies in the innovation trajectories. And again, you need the human talent, the human capital, the talent pipeline, education. You need sustain investments, the organizational ecosystem to be conducive to innovation, because for the most part, this innovation happens in the commercial civil arena, right? So if you are able to create that type of innovative ecosystem that generates economic prosperity, creates sort of a new engine of your economic growth, then you can leverage it for your international influence and as a soft power, creating attraction of other countries to that innovative hub, such as Singapore is doing, and really provide opportunities also for the next round of military modernization or phase for your military. So how nimble your military is to exploit and adapt these technologies, again, back to my institutional agility phase, this is opportunity for these countries. Because if you take the RMA of the 90s, all these major, very expensive weapons platforms, such as fighter jets, submarines, and the sort of the very, very unique, expensive type of weapons platforms, you don't necessarily have to have that industry to, focusing on that. You can focus on systems integration, AI development, creating that ecosystem, and that in doing so translate that into your advantage.
Yeah, I think what we've seen recently in Nagorno-Karabakh and also in Syria and Libya with the export of Turkish drones in the region, we've seen that the Turks have really invested in this and create a comparative advantage. So I tend to agree with you. Small states here have an opportunity indeed. Francesca, would you like to tackle the next question?
Yes. Do you think that institutional agility is easier to develop as a big power or as a small power? Has a small power in a globalized world still the possibility to field game-changing technologies?
Yeah, also, again, it's relative. It's related to the previous question. I think so. Look at a country like Israel. It's a relatively small state, but it has developed into a technological powerhouse and innovative powerhouse. It got to new technologies, cyber and other technologies. So small states, Israel, Singapore, middle powers, Korea, advanced small states and middle powers, if you will, who have invested into creating that ecosystem that is conducive to innovation in the commercial arena, can use it as an opportunity, again, to leverage the economic growth on that, to tap on talent, to attract talent, and accelerate the socio-economic development, if you will. So I would say yes.
And time is running fast, and so probably it's going to be the last question, and it has to do with Chinese capabilities in hypersonic weapons. And the question is, have this weapon the capacity? How is it changing the strategic balance regionally and also globally? Basically,
as also question for the entire seminar, I would argue that China as well as Russia and the US are experimenting with these hypersonic weapons. China has moved from conceptual into the experimentation phase. It has tested hypersonic weapons, including missiles, and that drone that I showed you in my presentation, the high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance drone, is part of that. It is again part of the debate of a lot of people saying there's a new game-changing technology that will change the character of warfare based on one single sort of type of technology. And there's, I think, a lot of it, it has been proven wrong historically. So no single technology, in previous conflicts will be the single determining factor, for your, comprehensive military advantage. Of course, there are examples, although there are some exceptions, but one technology alone cannot, change everything by default. So it has to come up with the concepts, how to use that technology, how you conceptualize the use of these technologies. You have to come up, with your integration of these technologies in your force structures. You have to have, the whole, gamut of things have to happen, how the new technologies are integrated with everything else to make a strategic impact. That said, of course, hypersonics provide, very exciting area because it's very difficult to counter them, right? So there is, that curve where you have a challenge in the sort of the innovation curve where you have a new technology that creates a strategic challenge, right? And you achieve that sort of dominance by leveraging these technologies. But at the same time, with every new technology, there's a counter technology. So how do you counter hypersonics? I don't know yet. I'm not an expert on that, but I would argue there is a lot of people thinking about, how do you counter, hypersonics with hypersonics or other means or asymmetric means, for example, taking out the satellite communications, the targeting aspects, sort of the soft part, the other components of these hypersonic missiles. So because they still need to target, they need to have a specific, intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance capabilities to target. So if you take out the ability to target, then the missile just, misses, its target. So it's a perennial, curve between challenge and counter innovation, both at the conceptual and technological level. So each side right now is trying to figure out how you outsmart your opponent with that particular, using these particular technologies or counter them. And that creates the dynamic of arms competition in the region, right? And whoever achieves, its the margin of technological superiority in that aspect can create a window of opportunity, some level of strategic advantage at some time, until you have that counter innovation element coming into the equation.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, that's a history of warfare. If you look at past developments, always this race between offense and defensive oriented weapons. You just highlighted also in your answer the growing role of space as a military domain. I mean, as I mentioned, time is really running fast. We're already 2 minutes over the allocated time. Michael, thank you very much for your insights. I mean, you cover a lot in an hour, so very thankful to that. Also, many thanks for all those who tune in this morning or this evening if you're in Asia. For following this discussion. If you want to know more about GCSP and our current activities, please log on our website, gcsp.ch. You can still register to the event that will take place today and tomorrow. You can also look at the type of courses and research that we are conducting. Very much look forward to listening back from you. Michael, we received some comments about whether your slides will be available. What will be available for sure is the recording of this webinar. So you'll find it on our website, gcsp.ch. So thank you again for tuning in, and we hope to see you soon in our next event. And Michael, again, thank you very much. And
thank you, Jean-Marc, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I wish you all the best. Happy Thanksgiving if you're from the States. And, be healthy. And thank you very much for joining.
Thanks. And also happy 25th anniversary at the GCSP.
Yeah, happy 25th anniversary.